Hi, Todd. Welcome to the Radical Therapist podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here.
Great to see you. Just saw you recently. I've seen you a couple of times recently,
Yes.
uh, I saw your presentation at the Therapeutics Conversations. Well, I've known you for a while. I should
Yeah.
say that. And so, I actually talked to you previous to your presentation, but I did see the presentation was blown away and really thought, oh, this was great and new. And so I'm glad you made some time to kind of share your work and some of the stuff you're doing with our audience. I think they're going to be excited about it. We should hit record. You know, I've been talking for about a half hour now already, and
Yeah.
they probably would have liked to listen in that conversation.
Maybe. Yeah, some of it.
Yeah, some of it. But anyway,
Yeah.
so it's great to have you here. And I guess I'm going to start with, maybe my first question is, kind of a slippery one, and that is, when you talk about poetics and therapy, what do you actually mean?
Yeah, way to start it with the easy
Yeah.
question because I think this is like something that really had a tough time kind of getting my mind around what poetics really meant. And I think one of the things that was really interesting was that I was really feeling like poetics was getting thrown around everywhere. I was going to conferences, I was reading articles, and I'd hear this poetics and poetics and poetics. And then when I started to research it, I was buying books and I couldn't really find a definition of poetics. And so there's one definition that I like, and then I'll kind of tell you maybe what I kind of came up with. There's this one book in the design field, the radical design field, Martin Avila that has this book called Designing for Interdependence, the Poetics of Relating. And his definition is the word poetic emphasizes the pleasurable engagement with things that are grasped yet not totally understood, something diffuse and agreeable that is composed, something akin to the search for beauty, a kind of perceptual seduction by actively partaking in affirming to some extent the life of others. Now, we could probably break that down for like an hour, but there's so much in there that I think poetics kind of speaks to that I think about in terms of how we use it in therapy. But I think on simple terms, I think poetics is kind of word art, and that I think because it operates within the arts, it brings with it some things that arts does to people. And so I think art is meant to evoke experiences. I think art disrupts our take it for granted lives, our lived experience.
Right.
I think arts draws from the aesthetics of lived experience. And I think this metaphor draws us kind of into the immediacy of our moments. It's not something that's happening yesterday or tomorrow, but it's something happening in the moment. I think poetics, kind of in addition, is kind of a function of language too. So I think it operates and how it communicates in a different way than, like, say, objective truths. I think poetics is communicating like something that defies definition. I think it's really when we're using poetics to describe something that it's often a translation error to put it into words. We can't quite fit it into it. So poets are often, alluding to something that goes beyond the words themselves. And so I think that this interpretation or this gap that gets created is important for resonance. That if we speak to it too directly, it loses the poeticness of it, it loses the artisticness of it if we speak too directly to it. So I think it's also a function of language and expression too, as well. So all that together, I think poetics is, a way that we're communicating something that's, knowable but unknown, something that's familiar but obscure, something that evokes emotions, something that evokes a human connectivity, and it's being done in the moment. So I'm sure that simplified it for you.
Well, we'll continue on that, but
Yes.
how did this project begin for you? Was there a moment in your work when you realized the poetic dimension wasn't being fully noticed or named?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of started in a couple places, and it was really a journey. I mean, honestly, it's still a journey for me that many people have contributed to. I think it's still going on, my understanding of it. But I think it originally started my narrative mentor, the Chia Gatone at Sonoma State. We would meet for like the last almost 20 years, and we just talk about narrative ideas. And she would call me up, and we'd talk for hours until my wife Stephanie would get annoyed, say, get off the phone, and we'd meet for coffee and stuff. And we started talking about these experiences we were having with our clients, where clients were kind of taken up by something. They were taken up by a conversation, and it felt like the way we describe it at the time was that they were seeing their lives anew, like they were experiencing their lives anew. And so what we started to think about was we knew that questions were kind of involved in this, but we weren't sure if it, like if it was the scaffolding of the questions or the direct questions. Now, at the same time, in the Bay Area where I live, our kind of main pipeline of narrative was Epstein. Epstein would come out to Berkeley at first twice a year and then once a year.
Right.
And Epstein was really working on at first kind of like what's a good story. And then over time, he was refining that much more to what's a good question. So when we'd go see him, it became so like very focused on the question. And I think this started to kind of gnaw at me a bit. I think there became something in the kind of the back of the mind that I kind of wrestled with a bit that kind of just didn't sit, it didn't just kind of sit well ultimately. And so I would go to, again, conferences and read articles, and I'd hear about poetics, and then, I started getting kind of more curious about this, and one I think it was like in Narrative Practice, the book that they put out after Michael White passed, where David Epstein writes this letter about Michael and talks about how poetic his therapy is, and then mentions, in personal conversation with Steve Madigan, how Steve Madigan's moved to tears, reading Michael's work. And so I went in to like look at his transcripts and his work, and I hope this is not sacrilege, but his questions didn't pop out as particularly poetic
Right.
to me. And one of the things but I would agree that I think his therapy was poetic.
Mm.
And one of the things that I think jumped out to me is that this distinction was really crucial, that where the poetics was coming from, in my estimation, was the client's lived experience rather
Mhm.
than the questions themselves. That these questions were scaffolding an experience from the client that I would say is poetic. And this got me to think much more about how did he turn people's lives into works of art rather than the questions. And was this his intention? And how did he do it? So this kind of got me to go much more into the literature about what was he saying and what was he doing. And it got me to pause this idea of focusing on the question a bit. So it kind of pulled me back a little bit. But it kind of started just from seeing these experiences and kind of going into the question,
Mhm.
but then I started pulling back from the question was a little bit of my journey on
Yeah,
that.
I
Yeah.
love that. And And you make me feel better about my own work. Because I think if you read a transcript of mine, or even just watch my videos and stuff like that, and really kind of look at the questions, you're not going to find a lot of poetics in them, right?
Well, I think that's one of the things that ultimately, right, when we get into like the ethics of this, is that it starts to shift it much more to the head than the heart.
Mhm.
And it starts to shift what we're listening to, and it starts to make it more about listening for to ask the question than to listening for what's precious to our clients.
Mhm.
Now, I think, there's probably a way of balancing these things to some degree, and really at this time, I see this on a continuum. I don't see it as forbidding this
Yeah,
and
right, right, right.
don't doing that. I see this on a continuum, and maybe we'll talk about it. But one of the first moments where I was like, "Ooh, narrative," I had a couple of those moments, but it was in graduate school. We had a narrative class, and they showed the video of Epstein working with a person that's battling anorexia.
Mhm.
He's in the hospital bed and he's asking her a bunch of questions. This is like 20 years ago, so if I get this wrong, but he's asking a bunch of questions. She's just like not answering, not answering, and then he asks her, something to the effect of, "How is it that anorexia gets you to go grinning to your grave?"
Mhm.
Right? I can't think of a more poetic question than that. And to me, in that moment, the direness of the situation requires a question of the similar magnitude,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And so I think on that level, right, like there's something important about reaching for something that's evocative, that gets a person's attention, but I think we also need, in my opinion, to locate it in an ethic too.
Mhm.
And so I also think that that's important. So I kind of now seeing it, it's on a continuum, but where could we locate ourselves, and that's kind of where
That's
I've
great.
been thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned, drawing on lived experience. You write that poetics is both a political act and one that enhances lived experience. And I'm wondering, how does something as subtle as language become political in the therapy room?
Yeah, I mean, one, I just, think, I guess the first thing I would say is that narrative I think, is probably very uniquely positioned to really separate itself from the field of psychology more firmly and to put itself more in the land of the arts,
Yeah.
where I think the field of psychology is cannibalizing itself in EBTs and skill-based therapies. I think it's contributing a lot to conditioning our citizens to think about themselves as being skillful or skillless. And I think language in how we think about this stuff is really important too. I think secondly, I think everything we do is political, So, and in particular, language, I think is political. One of the readings that I got into, that maybe I'd introduce at this point was, Kristen Ross wrote the Poetics of Everyday Life.
Mm.
And one of the things, a lot of the poetic reading that I was doing was really drawing this connection to everyday life, and it was interesting how these like themes would pop up. And in this book, she introduced this French philosopher, because again, if you're a
Yeah,
narrative, you have
right.
to have your favorite French philosopher. And again, I'll probably uh, mispronounce names. So, but his name's Henri Lefebvre,
Mm.
and he was in the 60s. in France. And one of the things that happened in France was capitalism came very late and rapid. So he kind of observed it. It wasn't like a slow moving coup. It was like this really quick experience. And so what Lefebvre kind of talked about was that that everyday life we're performing discourse essentially. So in our day-to-day experience, where so the distinction in some ways is like this course is kind of on this grander kind of scale. And Lefebvre was drawing more attention to the performance of life, so how we're engaging in the dissemination between people and place. So he also talked a lot about place too, like how we are developing town centers, how we're moving in the world. And so he really saw this as kind of like this site of great alienation between us because now capitalism at the time, right? We can probably transfer this to neoliberalism now or autocracy or whatever, we have to, whatever we're at now and post neoliberal culture that this gets into our interactions with one another. So even like how we talk about time, like we're wasting time or how we spend our time, right, starts to become our ways of interacting. We're competitive, we're producing culture, reproducing culture. So he saw this as a site of alienation amongst people, but on the flip, he saw this as a place where creation can take place, that disruption, resistance can happen in the more immediate moment. So I think this draws kind of our attention much more to the immediate moment and how language is kind of creating that in how we're interacting with one another. And so I think you know, I think in addition to that, the way that what we give kind of attention to, how we define things in people's lives. This is all kind of politics, where we locate people in the room, the lived experience. I mean, I think these things are probably pretty known to your audience. I would guess too. And also, maybe what we'll talk about is who is the artist
Yeah,
in
right.
this, you
Important
know.
topic. We'll get there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Who is the artist? Before we get there,
yeah,
you quote Michael White asking, "To what am I listening?" Quote.
yeah,
Poetics changes the way we listen. What are we listening for?
yeah, yeah, Chris, I love this question. And like, I mean, I think when I first kind of started this poetics, I was like, am I like making stuff up here? And it was kind of when I found this quote that like it really went, okay, like I'm kind of on to something. So this came, I think this is in the Spiritualities of the Surface article where Michael Hoyt is interviewing Gene Combs and Michael Wyatt at the Therapeutic Conversations two, I think it's two or three in Colorado. And so Michael's full quote is so I think this is kind of a big thing here. He says, I believe through the metaphor of poetics, it becomes possible for us to challenge the marginalization of existence and to play some part in honoring those facts of the little sacraments of daily living.
Yeah,
I mean, that's huge to me.
yeah.
I mean, one, I marvel at his use of the word sacraments, by the way.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
mean, there's a lot of choices of words. That one's really interesting. Now, of course, this comes from he's borrowing this from an Australian author, David Malouf, who wrote some philosophy, wrote some poetics, but primarily a fiction writer. And this quote comes from one of his fiction books, which is interesting too. But I think, although Michael doesn't tell us what to do, he kind of gives a couple important clues. He talks about the marginalization of existence and that poetics is going to do something about this. And then he talks about the sacraments of daily living. So if we kind of start broadly first, if we're thinking about what's marginalizing existence and knowing that Michael was a Foucault, a Foucauldian, right? We can probably guess that what's marginalizing existence is power knowledge, right? So reproduction of power. So it makes me think on one level, like how is poetics, disrupting the marginalization of existence. I mean, that's a pretty big statement in a lot of ways. And so I think it goes into a little bit of what I was talking about with Henri Lefebvre is that art is meant to disrupt the immediate experience. It's not meant to be familiar. Like
Mhm.
if you go and see something that's familiar to you, you don't think 2 seconds about it, right? It's meant to have and evoke a reaction, but in the immediate, right? So if reproduction of discourse is not meant to be interpreted. That's the part of discourse. We're just living it out. We're performing patriarchy. We're performing these things, right? But this gets us to stop and think. It gets us to create some, liminal space, some places where we can have some agency to look at what's happening by being confronted with things that might evoke a feeling from us. So that's what I'm imagining he might be saying here. I think the second thing, so for example, like I had a client that came in several months ago, and I mean, she sat down and I kind of did, my kind of what brings you here version of that. More creative than that, Chris, but
Not
and she
me.
just and she just kind of laid out, hey, I've been living my whole life,
Mhm.
and these things are not working for me anymore,
Mhm.
right? So, and gave me a list of these things. And what I think about is, what is this a refusal of? And what might be emerging in that person's life, right? So, what is the marginalization of existence here? What might be emerging as a response to that, right?
Mhm.
So then we think about the second part where he's talking about the sacraments of daily living. Again, like love this, right? It gives me goosebumps to think about this. And
Mhm.
and what he's drawing our attention to is something different than the marginalization of existence. Similar to Lefebvre is that it's a side of alienation, but it's a side of poiesis too, in the immediate moment. It's really what we're drawing our attention to, but it needs an awakening in order for this to happen. And so what this would be is about is like what we're giving value to, we're constructing our lives, and what holds significance for us, and what matters to us that's in our day-to-day life that we might be bypassing because we're looking forward, we're thinking about production, we're thinking about value, so we're reconstructing value from this kind of neoliberal kind of view
Mhm.
to taking and owning it in a different way, whatever that might be for the client, right? So another client example is I actually reached out to this client and asked her if I could use this, and knowing she might listen to this podcast, so hi if she's listening, but as she came in and very concerned about the political stuff. She has a child that she's very worried about the effects of the political climate, and very worried about the political climate on herself and her life and what this might mean. And I asked her some question about what did she think that this current state of affairs might rob from her that she would want returned, some version of that. And she told me beauty, right? But I've learned from Madigan, and Madigan would say is, I don't know what that means, like we need lived experience. And so I did what any respectable narrative therapy said would do, and I said, could you tell me a story about beauty so that I can see it through your eyes, so I can understand what's been taken from you, what's been robbed from you in this process.
Mhm.
And so she tells me about this. Her front yard. She said she has a front yard that's the size of a postage stamp, and her dog has gone out and destroyed the front yard, so they had to replace it with grass and with artificial grass, I should say. And she took her dog out one day, and there's this blood orange tree that's kind of hanging over, and underneath the tree, she saw this purple flower growing. And to her estimation, the purple flower should have been growing there, and she hadn't planted it there. And this flower became a symbol of kind of what was good in the world for her, what resistance could look like for her. Now, it wasn't to take away what suffering was, but it gave her the reason in which the suffering mattered. And really what was interesting was like almost like subsequent sessions came in. She's like, oh, I saw this purple flower, saw this purple flower. And after we had ended therapy, she had texted me and she's like in her 50s and she texted me she got a tattoo of a purple flower,
Nice.
first tattoo because I mean, I think it was so significant to her to have this as being a symbol for what this meant. So I think those are kind of the big categories. But I think another primary role of poetics is to kind of navigate the unknown and like what could be known. I think this is also, maybe we'll talk about this later too, is about this idea of connective resonance
Mhm.
that I think, poetics doesn't define experiences, but I think it helps us like get closer to complex experiences that requires an interpretation from the reader, from the client, from the person that's doing this. But it doesn't spell it out. But there's some resonant connection that's happening here too. So what I'm listening for on another level is like the language my clients are using, descriptions, metaphors, symbols, matters of the heart,
Mhm.
things that evoke something from them. And then I might, as Gertz would say, is descend into the details, or loiter from intent. I'm
Mhm.
often thinking like, is there a counter story here? And can this be developed into a counter story? And always in the back of my mind, I have this, what would this counter story say about what people are bringing with them to therapy? So those are some of the things that I might be listening for and listening to.
That's great. Uh, yeah, and you kind of set it up about your client that lost beauty. What does it mean to move from storying a life to beautifying it and to treating life itself as an art object? Referencing Foucault.
Yeah, gosh, not easy questions, Chris.
Okay, sorry.
Well, I think
I
this
love
is
this topic, so
yeah, good, good. Well, we should ask you these questions too. And I think this is one area where I think I've recently moved. Like I wouldn't use the word beauty anymore, although it does come up a lot in the literature. I think my understanding of aesthetics has changed a little bit. So I would think that like I would maybe kind of be more focused on life as lived art because I think what I would want to stay away from is kind of turning life into an object, but to kind of keeping it, kind of in a dynamic relational experience. And so it's so that we're more kind of recounting kind of like the immediate day-to-day experience. But I think what Foucault kind of talked about in terms of life as lived art is kind of really inviting people to be agents into their own life. And so he has kind of a theory of aesthetics too, which is kind of interesting. I mean, I'm just kind of getting into it a little bit, trying to understand it, right? Because I think Foucault takes time, you know. But one of the things I think he's saying is that like when we're becoming agents in our own life, what we're doing is kind of rejecting the subordination of the subject, right? So we're now seeing that we have more agency than the discourses would allow us to believe. So we can actively engage in poesis or creation. So he would talk about us to think otherwise, right? To think otherwise. So what I'm kind of thinking about here is like I'm worried about beauty in some ways being a prescription for how we should live life, or what a good life could be look like. But I think aesthetics gives us maybe a more a better definition in some ways.
Bigger and wider.
Yeah, and so I think with Foucault, he kind of talked about his aesthetics as involving this rejection of social norms, engaging in this transformation of choice, and leading to what he called ethical self-transformation. But I think basically what he's saying in some ways is being aware of who we're becoming and being aware of our own agency. So I think a lot of it is when people step into agency, I think poesis is becomes a part of, they're creating something that becomes more a part of it. I think in addition to that, I think then we might start to find those areas of life, what Michael White's talking about, the sacraments of daily living, or what Gary Saul Morrison talked about, where he reclaimed the term prosaics, that there might be these moments where we can see what's really afforded value to people is right in front of them. It's not some grand thing. It's not some big step that people have to take, but it's all around them. It's just being obscured by this need to be productive or to give value to things that are located outside of their selfhood. And so I think that's a lot of what I'm kind of meaning about life of lived art. And it also could mean too, like beauty doesn't mean pretty to me.
No, right,
Like
right, right. Yeah.
I think like when I like listen to like a record, like like I don't know, like I really like Magnolia Electric Company, like the Jason Molina stuff. I don't know if you ever listen to that, but it's sad music, but like whoever that person is for you, Elliott Smith or whatever, but like it's
Here.
sad. Yeah, you have it around you.
I was just looking for. I have a pennant that says "sad songs," and I was just looking for it.
Oh yeah, yeah. But to me, like I find so much beauty in there. And like when I'm listening to like a sad song, I probably feel more like connection to
Absolutely.
humanity than when I listen to like happy songs. So I think that's ultimately is like this way in which there's some resonance to something like bigger, but that it's felt through you, so it's familiar but unfamiliar at the same time. I think that's a closer definition for me to beauty, but I've been using aesthetics a little bit more because a little bit with Foucault, but also aesthetics is kind of like knowing life through the senses. And so, like, how are we knowing our lives through what we're taking in? And I think that this definition, I think, gives us a little bit more because it's really also the interpretation of the person rather than like we might conjure up some idea of what beauty means, and aesthetics I think is much more about the experience of the person too. So anyways, that's
Yeah.
one area I might move a little bit. Yeah.
All right. I have an ethical question.
Okay.
Who is the artist in narrative practice, and why does it matter?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this means everything, and I think, I mean, since we're talking about Foucault a little bit, it's about power and knowledge, right? And it's about who is, in control, who's assigning what. But I think this is why I needed to locate something in ethics here because you can see the potential drift to start to ask poetic questions, which starts to move the needle much more towards the therapist. So we start to listen more for our response rather than listening for the client's lived experience. And I think we start, and I'm guilty of this. I think this was, I believed very much in the for a time, that the power of the question, is really where it's at. But ultimately, I feel like it removed me from the client's experience. And when I felt like I stepped back from that, I felt like this like everything kind of emerged differently. It was almost like my therapy got like, I don't say this in this way, but like it was almost like my questions got more boring and the clients got more interesting. You know?
Oh, I love that. I love that description.
And it was like,
I align with it completely.
yeah, and I think it's like, I mean, I felt like that was, Michael. Again, other people might have other readings of him, and that's fine. But like, I think there was this way in which like it was more of like the help me understand. Can you get me the details? Can I picture it the way you picture it? It was in that drew forth much more about the clients, the people that are coming to see us, that they have sacraments in their life, that they have beauty in their life, they have aesthetics in their life, and that these things are being obscured by the problems and discourse and things like that. And it really, I think to me, made me much more appreciative of the lives that my the people that are coming to see me lived, where when I was focused on the question, sometimes I would walk out. I mean, probably a couple things. One is I'd walk out, did I do a good job or not do a good job? There's much more of an evaluation of me in that. And then I think there's another thing is I think sometimes the questions put an undue burden on the client. I think they're requiring the client to answer something that might be um, they're not always going to tell you, like, hey,
Oh
that
no.
question makes me feel dumb, or, and so I think we can end up causing this a bit of a performance thing. Now, I do think a part of our role as narrative therapists is to be good at questions. I don't think we can go in there and be like, otherwise we engage in structuralism because that's how we're trained to ask questions in our culture, right? But I think we have to be somewhat disciplined about making sure that we're coming from lived experience and making sure that it's really about listening first before it's about asking. So I think that when I made that conceptual shift and I think it made a big difference, and you can hear it in my transcripts and in the transcript I shared at TC 23, I would say my client sounds way more interesting than I do.
Well, yeah, and I appreciated you playing the audio, and it was like, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
So, and I think that's intentional. And what it reminds me of too is I don't know if you've seen the Picasso where he like draws a horse and it's really rendered out, like it's really like defined and then there's like another picture where it's like less rendered and then there's another one and by the time you get to like the fourth or fifth one, it's just a couple lines and it looks like a horse you know? And to me, like I think that's a sign of a really great artist is that they don't have to overcomplicate it, that they can allow for there to be the interpretive gap. They can allow for there to be, and that comes from the client, right? That's the important part of that power knowledge thing, right? The client interprets that. The client steps forward. It's not about the therapist. And so to me, I just sometimes think about that Picasso, I don't know if you've seen that, but it's really, interesting how by the time you get to the last one, it's just like, four lines and you're like, it's a horse. So yeah.
Great. And I was going to ask you about, but I think you kind of answered it about how might a therapist ask questions to draw out the poetics of the client rather than the poetics of the therapist. And
Yeah.
I think you kind of touched on that. But uh, can you maybe speak to how, and I know you're kind of maybe moving away from this word, but can you speak to how beautifying the everyday or aestheticizing the everyday or might serve as an act of reclaiming agency or identity?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's been kind of hidden on a little bit, but it also, I think you mentioned you liked, mispronounced word. I mispronounced names, Chris, but Wittgenstein,
Yeah.
Ludwig, and he had this quote that I think talks a little bit about this, that the aspects of things that are most important to us are hidden because of their simplicity and familiarity.
Mm,
One is unable to notice something because it is always before one's eyes. And this means we fail to be struck by what once seen is most striking and most powerful, right?
mm,
So I think that says a lot about this idea that we're taking from Lefebvre and Foucault about that there's the stability of reproduction in the center of our culture, that it's reproduction and production and reproduction. This is this subordination of subjects. So we're all just kind of going forward. We're all just performing capitalism, right? But on the edges, right, the edges of culture, we see variability grow, right? I think similarly to knowledge, knowledge at the very center is familiar, it doesn't require interpretation. It's just there, right? We don't need to think about it. But as we start to get to the outsides, right, the edges, the stuff that people bring into therapy, this now requires interpretation. And I think what poetics is doing is not defining it for the people that come to see us, but it's allowing for the interpretation. It's allowing for the gap to happen. That's where the variability lies. It's about bringing things into to knowing. So I think another person that I think I would kind of bring into this a little bit too, when we get into aesthetics, right?
mm,
So when aesthetics is kind of talking about the senses and it's going from the material objective world to the lived experience world, right? Sound familiar
mhm.
to me that this reclaims agency in the way that it's transforming kind of lived experience from this material world into a lived experience world. Now we have agency, right? Uh, Merleau-Ponty, so the phenomenologist, right? So I think he would suggest that this is done by our senses, but he says something really interesting. Is I think he rejects this mind-body split, right? So he would say that this is two sides of the same coin. So how we understand or how we make meaning is through our senses. That they're all together. They're not this dualist kind of thing, right?
Yep.
And so I think, and you put that with Foucault, who's saying this is a rejection of the objective world, that this objective world is being constructed through power knowledge and inviting, and then he would say part of that rejection is inviting more self-awareness, right? So you can see like how the stuff all kind of starts to come together in some ways. Like this was like when I was doing this research, this is like the parts that would give me goosebumps, right? To think about, and how this gives some potential implications for the power of the poetic metaphor, which Michael White called it a poetic metaphor for narrative practice, the way that we could be talking about the body or senses or immediate experiences in this more holistic, interpretive way instead of kind of piecing it out, right? The way that we can find ways for people to talk about their experiences in immediate moments without conjuring up structural metaphors, right? So I think in terms of identity, I'm social constructionist. So I believe in this kind of two-way street where we're being reacted with the world and we're also reacting with the world, and how we behave is kind of conducive to who we're becoming. And so I think poetics and poesis invites us to be agents in our lived experience and to reject the production, reproduction, dirge of everyday life, if you will, of lived experience. And I think it helps us become more reflexive of our lives, our values, our ethics, and versus being, kind of on a merry-go-round of taking part in, cultural discourse. So I think I don't know if I kind of drifted from the question, Chris, but but I think that's like the part of like reclaiming identity is really in these moments, of lived experience. And I think poetics, in addition to what I'm saying, is disrupting that, is creating this space, right? And I think that's where the narrative therapist really comes in. I think it's one of our gifts is then how do you take that and then restory it,
Mm,
right? How do you then start to find what does this mean for this person to start to step into who they might be becoming? Because there's a, you talked about with like liminal space, right? And this, this confusion, right, that kind of comes from. So this is how I've constructed my life for the last 50 years, but it's not working for me anymore. Well, what the heck does that mean? Who am I becoming? What does this mean where I'm going, right? And I think that we can kind of dive into their values, their stories, what matters to them, trace that through history, see if it's a counter story that might have something to say about what was happening in their life that wasn't working. And I think this is that restoring is where, narrative therapy is, this is what we're good at, I think. So, yeah, again, I don't know if I drifted too far from
No,
the
that was
question.
great. Thank you. I love your contrast between autobiographical memory, an example is, and then what happened, and poetic memory. You are not asked to remember, you're asked to imagine. And how does this distinction shift what we think therapy is for?
Yeah, and I think this is an area like, again, I think I'm working on, I'm kind of fleshing it out a little bit too. I think there's a couple things that, you know, I think, I've been thinking about with this. One is, it draws to me a little bit of like similarities to Foucault's contingent history. I think that autobiographical memory is a little bit in this, like the facts of the things, right? So it's not asking for people about their experience, it's asking for the objectiveness of it, right? Like who did what when. Where poetic memory and Molly Andrews would say all memory. I mean, a lot of people would say all memory is imaginative,
Mhm.
right? And so I think when we are, and Foucault kind of talks about contingent history to kind of, talk about the fallacy of determinism, like that just because it happened doesn't mean it was supposed to happen or has to happen this way. And I think poetic memory goes beyond the act, having this accuracy of the memory to represent more what's resonant and what's symbolic in people's memories, right? So I think and when people are remembering, they're remembering as if it's happening in the moment when
Right,
things are
right.
resonant, right? So, and I think there's like the things that have like that evoke something that have matters of the heart, as I say, people are re-experiencing it in the moment as if it's new again, right? So again, now we have another example of it's in the moment, right? It's not yesterday, it's not tomorrow, right? So that memory is being brought into that immediate moment. So um, and we're not putting it up against a truth test. We're really talking about what's resonant in that. And so I think this is an area I'm still, working on a little bit, but I've kind of thought about a little bit of this idea of it's people. Well, you talk about like futuring, right? So I think like, and that's, area I've been curious about too, is like how past, colonizes the future, and autobiographical memory kind of predicts like this determinism, the fallacy of determinism that Foucault talks about. But poetic memory starts to challenge that a little bit, right? It starts to bring forth other ways of experiencing things. And I'm not saying like we're imagining like we're just like, imagine yourself being different in the past. It's really we're looking again for, things that might have meaning, like lived experience, and bringing that more forward into the conversation. So sometimes it's details. Like I remember Lucia would talk about a case that she had where a person had gone through lots of tough stuff in their life, and it had frozen her in time,
Mhm.
right? And Lucia, they had tough time talking about it, and Lucia asked her a question about what kind of dress she was wearing, because she had mentioned something about her dress and the weather or something like that, and it was like this flood of memory, kind of came back to her, right? And and that became kind of this point of being able to talk about her experience. It like was evoked in that moment. There was something present with her in that moment. So still thinking about this area, but the part I like about it is just thinking about this contingent history versus, deterministic kind of like future telling versus.
I'm really interested in that space as well, and I'm thinking a lot about like being time, right? Like how future and past are all at play in the present, right? And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot there that it seems like you're still thinking about, I'm still thinking about, and
Yeah. Well, I think your recent presentation is kind of, put that more forward for me to think about that for sure. So it's it's not, these things all kind of come together in some way.
you know.
Yeah.
All right. What cautions or considerations do you offer therapists who want to work more poetically but risk aestheticizing someone's suffering?
Well, I think we've been talking about it a lot too, but like I just think like, I would just kind of suggest that people listen. I think that people just listen carefully to what their clients are telling them and to ask questions that are drawing forth, their lived experience. I think that's really the important part. I think if we start to think about doing something to them, we start to get into some controlling an outcome to some degree. And I think that if we're just listening, I think we listen hard, well enough, or we invite enough lived experience, we will hear this. People talk in values. I mean, problems tell you what people care about, right? I mean, the absent but implicit is a helpful tool because if people didn't care about their problems, they wouldn't be there, right? So there's always like if we listen, we'll hear those moments and hear those values. I think if we just listen to ask a question, now we're in the realm of intervention. Now, when I'm teaching when I'm teaching that, and supervising, that's one of the hardest things for young therapists is they just get so
Yeah.
into this intervention mode, right? What do I do now? What do I do now? What do I do now? And it's like, again, talk about confusion or liminal space. It's like when you're saying, like let the client, listen to the client. They're like, what is that gonna do? Right? Like it's not doing anything. And I'm like, what is your client saying? Right. And a lot of my trainees, track outcomes too. And I'm saying, well, like look at that. And they're like, well, they're getting better. They say they like therapy. And I'm like, is that good enough? Is that good enough for you? Because once we start to take on this intervention, now we're trying to do something to our client, and I think I would just say, if we trust our clients and we listen, I think that's the most important part. I do think your part about aestheticizing someone's suffering. I want to make that clear, and hopefully it's clear already. I'm not saying we need to cheerlead people. We need
Right.
to take away. I think, how maybe mindfulness is being used in certain corners, that's kind of separating it from its spiritual roots to just say, be okay or accept something that people shouldn't have to accept. I'm not saying that at all. I think people should be upset about a lot of things. And I think there's things in people's lives that they can connect to that gives them purpose and meaning at the same time. And so that's what I would say is to kind of make that part clear. Yeah.
Yeah, you did mention, supervising and training, and I know you've been doing that for a long time. And I'm wondering, how do you help new therapists develop this sense of, and I'm asking for myself too, because I do a lot of training.
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
help new therapists develop the sensibility, not just the skill of poetic speech acts, like metaphor, resonance, animating the ordinary?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think what I want to do a lot is, kind of I do want to give my trainees a list of questions that would bring forth like what matters to that client? Why are they there? Where are they going? What matters to them? I want to give them a place to start that's more about the well-being of the client rather than the distress of the client,
Mhm.
and to find out what's meaningful about this. So I think that's an important place to start for folks. I think in that, and again, we've talked a lot about lived experience and bringing that forth to the details of people's lives, to not take the platitudes as, as enough. So many people do that. Like, I just love, I use this example of like a lot of my students will see Steve Madigan's video on Psychotherapy Net where he's working with this guy, and the guy says, I have anxiety, and Steven says, what's that? I don't know what that is, right?
Mhm.
And what it does is the guy explains what it means to him, right? And so what I'm always asking them to do is say, what does that mean to you? And get them to tell stories about them. Get them to say what it means to them. And I think that when you start to do that, one, I think the trainees' anxiety goes way down because now they're working with a person and not a problem. But I also think that they start to hear the humanity in all of this stuff. Now they become not just a list of problems on a piece of paper or on an intake form, but now they become people who are dealing with the same stuff that we're all dealing with in life. They're sitting across from them, and so I think that's something that's really important. Now, I'm not really teaching them like, I'm not proposing like a model here, although I've called this kind of narrative poetic inquiry. I don't know, that's, branding, you gotta have branding or something, but like I think I'm not proposing like a model here, but I think a list, I think starting with getting them to listen, I think that's where I'm at. So I because I do think the poetic questions are like, stage 2 or stage 3 or whatever. So I'm just trying to get them to listen, you
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
We do. Are you familiar with the Martian exercise? Have you used that?
No.
Okay. I got a copy of it from John Stillman at the Casperson Center
Oh,
in Minnesota a long time ago, and
yeah.
it's a wonderful, 20 questions about what is happiness, and you're a Martian coming down, and I find exercises like that pretty helpful for new folks to, because
Yeah.
we make this assumption, well, hey, he's happy, we know what that is, right? But do we really know what that is?
There's so many things. Like I think like Larry Kiermeier's new book on metaphor. I forget the full name of it. Oh, Healing and the Invention of Metaphor. It's a really good book, but he like the way I think about like metaphors, like on a continuum, like on one end of the continuum, it's a shortcut in our language.
Mhm.
We're just doing it, and everybody goes, I know what you're talking about, right?
Mhm.
But do we know really what the details are of this? And so we talk in this way, and now diagnoses and problems kind of fit the bill of that, right? Like when we say anxiety, most of us go, well, I know what you're talking about. So I'm trying to get them to say, well, what does that really mean for that person,
Mhm.
right? How would they describe that? Let's get them to tell kind of a story about that. And then I think you can really kind of get to it a lot more. I think on the other end, just to complete that, that thought is on the other end, I think metaphor is really about bringing new things into being, new things into knowing. I think Nietzsche talked about that as like metaphors, the invention of language. And so we have this wide continuum to where it can do something that's really bringing something new into it. But on the other end of it, it could just be something we just go, yeah, I don't even have to think twice about that.
Mhm.
So how much of are we listening to our client's language and not thinking twice about it?
Exactly.
So how do we stop and go, wait a minute, what do you really mean by that? What's important about that? And to kind of start to slow down on that stuff. So yeah, yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions.
Okay.
Bachelard wrote that imagination is a kind of dwelling. How do you see therapy as a poetic dwelling space?
Oh, Chris. just for the viewers, Chris knows that Bachelard's the bane of my existence, and I don't get Bachelard, and he makes me feel like I'm losing my mind. But I think, here's the thing. So let me read a quote so people kind of get this. So if you read maps, right, and Michael White references Bachelard. In fact, on VSNT Live, Steve Madigan's platform, there's even a video where David Epstein and Michael White are like talking, and I think it's like Michael White has to go to the bathroom in the middle of this video, and David Epstein's like, "Hey, you should tell him about that book you're reading, The Poetics of Space by Bachelard," you know. And so there's like in this video, but in Maps, Michael White said references Bachelard as one of his major influences. He says that I have considered his ideas highly relevant to therapeutic practice in general and outsider witness practice in particular. So, I mean, that's a pretty big endorsement. I mean, he goes on to say that outsider witness practice way he used Bachelard is to the use of image, reverberations, and resonance. So, and then I don't know if you know the storyteller, mythologist Martin Shaw. Like I was watching this YouTube. Yeah, he's really interesting. And this YouTube, he was saying, "Oh, Bachelard's Poetics of Space, one of the greatest books." And I'm like, like, but I've read him, and I don't get him at all. But like, so help me out. But I like your reading of him and this way of thinking about it as space, right? Because I think it goes to a couple things. One is, I think, thinking about the therapy room and how we construct a world in there, right? So by what we ask, what we point to, what we pay attention to, what we draw forth, creates a world. We're essentially telling our clients what's important, what's possible, what's meaningful in here, right? And so if we're constructing a world where imagination is and poetics is a part of the conversation, that's going to happen more. If we construct a world that's about objective reality, it's about diagnosis, it's about interventions, guess what's not going to happen in there, right? So I think like how the way that we are speaking to, asking questions, all that is starting to tell what this room is really about. So I like that reading of it, what we draw attention to, and what we're doing. Michael White's reading of it, I think, brings us a couple other elements to it, so I think these ideas of image resonance and reverberation, right? And he's using these primarily in outsider witness practice, right? And
Mhm.
so one of the things that Bachelard talked about is resonance. And I like this quote. He called resonance sentimental echoes, right? So I think that's really cool, where emotion and memory and meaning, it's like when we hear the poem, right? So emotion, memory, and meaning, right? And remember, this is Michael White talking about this, right? He also talked about reverberation is where we're possessed by the poem as if it's our own, right? It takes us over, right? So it's not just like we're connecting, we're taken over by this, right? Interesting thought, right?
Mhm.
And so in other words, I think resonance is like the kind of the connection, and reverberation is how we're moved by it, right? So how we're moved in the moment. That's how I've been thinking about it. And so I think this has implications for this idea that poetics is speaking to some human connectivity, some way that like, so I read at my TC presentation, I read a Tony Hoagland poem,
Yeah, right.
right? And Tony Hoagland wrote this poem that I read. I think it's called Bliss, and he wrote this poem when he was dying of cancer, right? And I mean, obviously that's not an experience I've had, but the poem is deeply resonant to me. Like I feel something when I'm reading this, even though it's not my experience. I get it on this bigger human level, it means something to me. And I think this is what he's talking about with outsider witness practices. Or Andrea Gibson, everything that Andrea Gibson writes, even though our lives look maybe different, our lives are different, constructed very differently. I deeply resonate with their work,
Mhm.
you know? So I think there's a way in which we can draw much more of a human connectivity that goes beyond like having to match. There's
Right.
something more there. And I think, maybe I'm going too far, but I think that's where Michael White is saying is that when an outsider witness is looking, is speaking to something that they're hearing in a session, it's deeply, reverberating and resonant, right? It's connecting and it's possessing of a person's life. And I think that's this human connectivity that's happening in this immediate moment. So again, I think Poetics kind of offers this part of it. So that's another reading of Bachelard. But I'll tell you, it's like your reading and Michael White's reading that I get. I don't get his reading of it when I read. And I've even read like a study guide. There's like a study guide, and I read that and I still like, I don't know. So so yeah, help me out,
Yeah.
Chris.
All right. A couple more questions. What have your clients taught you about poetics that theory never could?
Yeah, such a good question. I mean, I think just to continue what I'm talking about a little bit is how deeply resonant I feel to my clients' lives. And it doesn't matter, if they're, 12 or 70 or what background they come from. But I think poetics, to me is like when I'm really listening to these stories is, like I relate in this really like, like we're talking about, you know, uh sad songs or something like that, or whatever. I mean, I relate in this really meaningful way, and so I think you know when people talk about what matters to them, what they hold dear, I think it evokes something in me too, and I think that's something that they've told me that theory couldn't have told me, but you have to listen for it. I think when you're in your head and you're thinking about questions, I don't think you feel that if you don't give it space. I think one thing that poems, and again, poetics and poetry are not the same thing, right? But poems often use space in a way, right? And that I think the space in the session sometimes builds up some of that like drama or some of the feelings around that too. And I think that's one thing that I think my clients have told me, have taught me that goes beyond theory. So whether it's a purple flower or somebody's experience of being in the mountains in the Sierra Nevada mountains, or I had a client talking to me about singing to her child when
Mhm.
they're going to sleep, like, these are touching moments. And to me, this is like what really constructs life. It's not about productivity and how much does that take space in our lives,
Mhm.
and how much that draws us into doing things that keep us away from the mountains and keep us away from the flowers and keep us away from singing to our children, and so I think to me that like makes me want to come home and sing to my children and do things like that too. So I think I wrote my dissertation on the therapeutic relationship and use it in narrative therapy, and they talk about this two-way street a lot. And I don't think I needed to read about that to know about it.
Mhm.
So I think when we ask those questions, there's something much more like, people kind of say, oh, narrative's like so heady. For me, it's so hard. I can see what they're saying. We talk
Sure.
about, I mean, Foucault, and we're talking about, you know,
Bachelard.
Bachelard and all that stuff. But it all boils down to like, what do you ask the person in front of you? And to me, that's like this great like funneling of things to get to this like really, heart-based work. I don't know, to me, it's the alchemy of narrative therapy that's just, beautiful. So
Love that. Thank you. Okay, last question I ask everybody. Uh,
yeah, yeah.
Todd, what books, films, ideas, thinkers, what's capturing your attention these days?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's your last question, so I had time to prepare. But after PC 23, I had to take like a intellectual break, so I read some fiction for a while because I love fiction. I think fiction's one of our best teachers. I think I've been starting to pick up again a little bit lately. I have a presentation in Chicago that I'm doing at the National Association for Poetry Therapy, so I'm really curious about interacting and seeing what kind of they're about. And so I've been reading a little bit more in this poetic inquiry as a research methodology. They just had like 2 years ago, I think, a conference in South Africa, and a lot of it's like based on this social justice and decolonizing work around getting into the a person's internal language rather than kind of research language. And so I'm just kind of dipping my toe into that, but really fascinated by that. So Sandra Faulkner would be somebody in that um, realm. I think we were talking a little bit about the earlier about the before the started the narrative psychologist field.
Sure.
So Sarah Cobb and Molly Andrews. I think they're saying a lot of really interesting stuff. So the Oxford Press, they have a lot of really interesting stuff. And then the this in the poetry realm. So I probably should confess too that I really don't like hadn't read a lot of poetry in my life. So I didn't come to this through like loving poetry, which I think a lot of people do.
Mhm.
Um, and I think I've been trying to read more poetry to try to get it. It probably hits me one every like 30 poems, but I don't know if I should confess that at this point. But this I've been interested in this they call it like the language school of poetry. So this would be like Charles Bernstein and what's his name? Barrett Watton and Lynn Hydrogen. Probably mispronouncing her name. She passed away like a year ago. And they kind of have a very similar idea of like narrative therapy. It's about like deconstruction and looking at kind of postmodern kind of ways of doing this, and it's very political. And so I've been kind of interested in what they're kind of saying too. And then probably the last thing is really I probably have gotten like most of my book recommendations from you, to be honest. And so I think the design field, like I mentioned, Martin Avila, um, and
Escobar.
yeah, and relationality with Arturo Escobar, and then Tony Fry with defuturing practices. So I've been really thinking as you have been about what the future, because I feel like a lot of my clients are coming in talking about the future and what it means to them. And so I think your presentation and just listening to a little bit differently to a person's relationship to time and person's relationship to space, and just that's kind of really, I think, opening my eyes to a lot of that stuff, but just so the futuring practices. So I was reading that book Against Progress by Zazik, and so those are some of the areas. Oh, and then the other thing I'd say too, just real quick, is Russell Mears. The other thing I've been kind of interested. So like Michael White kind of had these people that influenced him that like doesn't get picked up a lot, but Russell Mears wrote this one book, The Poet's Voice in the Making of the Mind,
Hmm.
and and he taught this is I think where Michael White gets kind of influenced around William James' stream of consciousness.
Right, right, right.
And so I because he references Michael White references Russell Mears. That's how I kind of found him. And then and he talks about the stream of consciousness, and I think about that with time
Mhm.
too, right? Because trauma and other things are stopping that. And so and then he's talking about poetics too. So, so that's kind of something I've been interested in a little bit is Russell Mears. And then I just never get disappointed when I go back and read the originals, honestly. Part of my presentation, I read, Gertz and Goffman and Bardou talking about exoticizing the domestic as a way of disrupting the moment, and then Michael White's original stuff. I just like I feel like I could read it 100 times and get something new from it every time. So I just have maybe I have like some sort of literary ADHD, but I just kind of just rotate books, and I love it. It's my creative outlet is reading this stuff. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. All right, Todd. This was been everything I imagined it would be. I really appreciate you making the time and sharing your work with us. And I'm just fortunate I get to be in conversation with you just outside of this podcast too. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Chris. Me too. I feel fortunate. And I'm just really, it never was on my vision board, like presenting at TC
Yeah.
and Stephen Madigan saying, hey, I want you to do this, and it's never on my vision board to be on this podcast, which I've been listening to forever, and just respect your work so much. I mean, that's how we started talking, was I just wanted your opinions about things because I just think you're such an important leader in our field, and so it's like, wow, what a privilege to be here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks, Todd. And to be continued.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll come back part two.